Hi golfers, Rob Cheney here from GOLFTEC Singapore. In today's video we're going to continue our discussion around the wrists, and this time I'm going to be using the Hackmotion wrist sensor. This is, according to the Hackmotion website, this is the only complete wrist solution for golf training. So I'm really excited to receive this product and looking forward to sharing some of my learnings with you. So in today's video we're going to discuss the topic of the flat left wrist, or the flat lead wrist, left wrist if you're a right-handed golfer. And it's a concept that's been around for a really long time. The Golfing Machine book actually describes the flat left wrist as one of the three basic imperatives, suggesting that it's very important. I would generally concur with that idea as well. I think it's generally considered that a flat left wrist, whether that be at the top of the swing or at impact, is not only desirable, but maybe even essential. But as my understanding of how the wrists work in the golf swing has developed over the years of teaching this game, you start to realize that nothing's necessarily quite as simple as that. So I'm going to discuss in a little bit of detail today what I've learned so far from using Hackmotion, how that could help your game and help you hit the ball better. So I would encourage you to strap in and be ready for some new information that you've probably not heard before. I'm going to really try and focus in on some of the commonalities in terms of the patterns that players present with. So today's going to be an introduction to that. I'm going to really just look at the way I do the swing, and having looked at some of the other coaches here at GOLFTEC, we've noticed some things that all good golfers are doing. So I think I'm going to share that with you. But over the coming weeks, I'm determined to share future learnings with you as well. Things on pitching, chipping. We can even look at how the wrists work in putting. So what I want you to do is get down in those comments. Let me know what you'd like to see videos on regarding how the wrists move. There's an almost infinite number of topics, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, and I'll try and make the content go in that direction over the next few weeks. So as I'm learning more about this, I'm going to share that with you. This should be a good journey. If you're not already subscribed, guys, please make sure you click on that subscribe button and the bell. Don't miss out on any new videos. This is going to be a fun ride. Okay, so let's start with some basic stuff. I think just understanding certain wrist movements is important. I have covered this in previous videos. You can certainly go back and take a look through those if you want to understand things in a little bit more detail. Today I'm going to try and keep this piece of it short and then get into the hitting and show you what I've noticed and what I think would certainly help people strike the ball better. So there's a couple of basic wrist motions that I'll just describe. We could actually do it here looking at the motion here on the Hackmotion sensor. So when I flex my wrist, and I'm just talking lead wrist now. So flexion is the bowing of the wrist like this, and extension is the cupping of the wrist in the opposite direction. So flexion and extension like so. And then in this plane of motion, the up and down plane like this, you're going to have radial deviation, which is cocking or moving the club up towards the radial bone, or ulnar deviation, which is the uncocking towards the ulnar bone this way. Okay, so those are the basic terminology. I won't get into too much depth of that today. I won't try and overcomplicate things. We are primarily going to be looking at the flexion and the extension piece, which is really the twisting of the wrist about the shaft. And that really is the primary control piece for the club face. I think the reason the wrists are so important to discuss and try to understand is that ultimately the way you hold the club and then the way you move the club with the wrists really is primarily club face control. There's obviously some power pieces in there as well, for sure. And how you match all that complex stuff together really determines how good or bad you are at golf. So the best players seem to have some certain commonalities, and it's those things that I want to try and share with you today. So today's video is called Flat Left Wrist, Yes or No. I think it depends. I've already touched on the fact that the wrist's a very complex subject. There's no denying that. There's no 1 or 2 YouTube videos that are going to be able to lay out in its full entirety the complexities of the wrists and how they move. But for me, I'd say it like this. It depends on a lot of things, primarily grip type. So how you grip the club is going to determine whether your wrist should be flat or flexed or extended. But also, it's not so much about the position. It's not so much about a split second in time. I think we have got fixated over time about flat left wrist at the top and somewhat flat left wrist at impact. But those are positions, and they can be created in different ways. It's more for me in terms of what I've seen and how I watch golfers do this. It's more about the motion and the direction that the wrist is moving into. So I'll just expand on that a bit, because I think it's actually the way the wrist is moving through time and space which is far more important than whether it's perfectly flat at the top or perfectly flat at impact. So I'm going to go ahead and hit one, my standard 7-iron, nothing too complex here, just normal swing, and then we'll take a look at the way I've moved the club in order to hit the shot that I've hit. Pretty solid 7-iron there, just hit it out there at 155 meters, 170 yards, little bit of a push draw. It's pretty centered contact as well. So I wouldn't be terribly disappointed with that shot. I feel like that was fairly reflective of my standard pattern. So what have I done in order to produce that shot with my wrist, and specifically my lead wrist? Let's get into that and take a look. So I would say I have a fairly neutral grip, meaning the expectation here would be pretty typical for someone who wanted to draw the ball with a fairly neutral grip. Some of these numbers would change if my grip was extremely strong or extremely weak. I certainly think I'll get into that over the coming weeks and try and explain how the different grip types require different wrist motions and different matchups to make them work. But in the first instance here, we're just looking at flexion extension. So flexion extension, which is flexion and extension. When I set up, I have 14 degrees of extension in my lead wrist, meaning it's very slightly cupped. That would be pretty typical for a neutral type of grip. The more I turn my grip to the left, the weaker I have it, the flatter this would become, less extended, and even to some extent slightly flexed. And people who grip the club were extremely strong would tend to have more of a initial extension or cupping in the wrist to begin with. But mine's there at 14 degrees. What do we learn going through to the top? Well, at the top of the swing, interestingly, given the name of this video, should the left wrist be flat, at the top of the swing, my wrist is in 0 degrees of flexion or extension, meaning it is flat. Flat based on how I've calibrated this sensor. So I've moved during the backswing, I've moved or twisted, if you like, the wrist has moved from 14 degrees of extension to 0 degrees, meaning there's a closing or a twisting of the club. You may have been told to do that in previous sessions or lessons you've had with professionals, particularly if you're a slicer of the ball. So that's one of the common mistakes we see in the backswing, with the club face opening and we're getting to the top with this cupping or this extension in the lead wrist. And I'm describing there the fact that I've moved my wrist, I've literally twisted the club, a little bit like a twisting if you were twisting on a motorcycle throttle, trying to turn the club as I go back. And what's interesting in my experience of teaching this move is, for me and for many good players, they do this now automatically, whether they were taught to do it or whether they just discovered how to do it. What's so interesting whenever I'm sharing this idea with a student or a player, they're very surprised that that's what you're supposed to do. It's like, oh, I have to actually twist the club, and it feels quite alien to them, especially if their pattern is the opposite. But it's interesting to actually note there that that's generally the movement that's happening in good players. Wherever they start at setup, they are moving towards flexion or a more flat wrist at the top of the swing. So we'll take it up to the top. The flexion extension is going to move to 0. That's right at the top there, 0. And in transition, there is very little change in my wrist condition from a flexion extension point of view. So I'm still in even halfway down there, look at that number that reads 2 degrees of extension. I've gone from flat, and as I've pulled this club down, I've maintained within a degree or two, I've maintained how flat this piece of my wrist has stayed. And I think that and this piece of the swing is the most critical part to get right with the wrists. It's the bit where the golfer is putting the most power or force into the shaft, and that's a big part of how they're trying to create power. And as they're pulling on the shaft, the way that they twist the wrists is enormously enormously affects the outcome of how the face is going to be positioned. So how golfers learn to pull this shaft and put power into the club massively influences how they move their wrists, which influences the face, which starts to predict whether their ball's going to go straight or off on an angle that they can't control. So getting the wrist right in transition is critical. What I've tended to see in transition, players who are better than me are actually adding a little bit of the flex, adding a little bit of the closing piece in the downswing. I'm keeping it fairly neutral, but I'll tell you that the golfers who struggle the most as they're pulling this club down, they're not keeping this flat. If they got it flat at the top, they're not keeping it there. They're starting to extend and cut this wrist in early downswing. And once you do that, it's a recipe for disaster. The club face is completely out of whack, so is the shaft. You've got a tiny amount of time to try and fix that. So getting the wrist flat at the top, maybe, moving the wrist into a flatter or flexed condition on the start of the downswing, definitely. And in the final piece of the swing here, coming down from sort of P6, shaft parallel to the ground, the wrist is moving from this flat condition, and then you'll notice how that number changes, begins to become negative, -4, -6, -8, -9 at impact. That's describing how in the last part of the swing, I'm moving the wrist into a little bit more flexion just as I reach impact, which means my wrist is flatter. So should my left wrist be flat, my wrist is flatter at impact than it was at setup. That's describing that little bit of forward shaft lean, that flying wedge position that Golfing Machine talks about, that I've certainly spoken about in lots of previous videos. Getting that ability, having that ability to make good contact, hit down slightly on the golf ball with a little bit of shaft lean and compress the ball. That's evident and certainly noticeable in my swing. And that's why I'm such a big fan of prescribing for you these drills that have short follow-throughs with the hit hard, stop quick exercise where you stop very soon after impact. And the reason I like to prescribe that is it's training your wrists to stay in the right condition for long enough before they ultimately, and they should do this, before they ultimately start to extend into the follow-through. The golfer is extending, the wrist is moving towards some extension through impact. Some golfers really do try and overdo this piece. But what you're seeing there is at impact, I'm more flexed forwards than I was where I started. And then I'm beginning to extend and release the club, if you like, into the follow-through. Those are the things I've seen so far in my teaching experience from using camera for 25 years. But now I'm also starting to see that that pattern is being far more consistently replicated by good players, testing the other coaches in the center here, and beginning to look at some of my students using this sensor, how their wrist patterns differ entirely. Let's hit one more. That one started a little straighter than I might have liked. Similar distance, little bit of an overdraw. Quite similar numbers. If you remember address last time, I was 14 in extension. This time I'm at 13. The top of the swing, I was flat or 0. This time I'm 3 degrees of flexion, so very little to choose there. And then when I hit the ball, little bit more flexed. So just having that shaft lean, this time 8 degrees. Previously it was 9. So the consistency of that pattern is pretty strong. Just move through that and take a look at the the way we move through the swing there. So flexing the wrist towards the top or keeping it flat, keeping it very flat through transition, somewhere between -3, 0, and then -3 again, turning down towards impact where you hit the ball, and then at impact and very quickly afterwards, moving strongly and quickly into extension. So going back to my point, it's really not the position that matters, it's the direction in which that wrist and the motion of that wrist at any point in time, which, to be honest, without a sensor and without measuring it, is really not 100% easy to see. So it isn't just the position, it's the movement and the motion of how these wrists are moving through the time and space of the swing. Quite a complex subject, but certainly something that an expert instructor can help you with. To summarize what I would tell you to do with this video, particularly if you're struggling with your ball striking and struggling with your contact, if you're a bit of a slicer, it's going to be turn the wrist down, flat or flexed in the backswing, and as you hit the ball, try to maintain that feeling of keeping the wrist flexed or bowed. So guys, there's some insight into the movement of the lead wrist in an expert player. I think the summary would be, number one, everybody starts in a little bit of extension, depending on your grip type. Mostly everyone's got a little bit there, but the real learnings are on the backswing, how that moves towards flat, meaning there is that twist downwards of the club face necessary for most players, I would say. And then the second piece would be in transition, better players are still either keeping that wrist flat or twisting it down somewhat more. There's a couple of exceptions to that, but there aren't many. So I think the worst players I see and the people struggling to hit the ball far and struggling with slicing in particular would really have that wrist in extension through pulling the club down incorrectly. So as you're coming down, just check that that's as flat as possible. And then at impact, lots of the drills that we've discussed over the time about hitting hard and stopping quick, keeping the arm straight, keeping the handle slightly forwards. The club head is at that point in time trying to overtake the hands, and the wrist is moving into extension. It's just that for the majority of golfers, that movement into extension, that cupping, happens prematurely and happens down there way before the ball. So the feeling is often necessary that you feel you're keeping this flex and this flat wrist for longer. It may not be the reality. The only way to know for sure, go and take a lesson at your local GOLFTEC, go and find your stack and tilt authorized instructor, highly educated golf professionals who can help you play better golf. That's it for today. Really appreciate you watching. Don't make any apologies for the fact these videos have a bit more detail. My job and role, I feel, is to try and help educate golfers into becoming better players. If you want tips on 2 turns and a swish, go ahead and find a channel that fulfills that purpose. I'll try and keep bringing you accurate, functional, educational material that really does help you to play better, improve your game, and your overall enjoyment of the game. Before I finish, I have to say thank you to a couple of people. Hackmotion for sending me this sensor. I'm really excited to start working with it. Good friend of mine, Scott Cowks, who has some extremely good videos on YouTube regarding Hackmotion. If you're a bit of a nerd and you like to understand how these things work in detail, check out Scott's videos on YouTube. Just Google or search for Scott Cowks, C-O-W-X, Hackmotion. Some really interesting discoveries that he's made since using the sensor. I'm going to try and add to that library of videos that are online now. Over the coming weeks, as I've said, I'll make some new ones. I'll add to the detail and add to the variety of the content. Do make sure you jump in the comments and let me know what you thought of this video, and of course anything else you'd like to see regarding the wrists. Stay tuned guys, until next time, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you very soon for another video.